There was once a period when working the land truly paid off. Rain arrived on time, and the earth stayed solid beneath the plow. Barns filled to their rafters, and ledgers closed the season balanced and clean. Farmers could stand at the edge of their fields with quiet pride. Not wealthy, but secure. Families shared the labor. Debts stayed within reach, and hope for the next harvest always felt close enough to touch. That world feels distant now. Drought scorches the same ground where rainfall once nourished life. Rising prices for fertilizer and fuel devour profits before the crops even sprout. More fields are left bare. Machinery gathers dust in sheds, and some farmers walk away from land that's been in their families for generations. It isn't laziness. It's exhaustion, the heavy toll of too many losing years. In the moments ahead, we'll travel through 7 states where this burden has pushed farming to its limits. These are places where growers aren't only losing their income, but the very ability to keep farming at all. Kansas. The decline came quietly to Kansas in the spring of 2023. There was no dramatic storm or single disaster, just unending weeks of dry wind beneath skies that refused to rain. By summer, the wheat was gone. Fields once golden and thick now lay pale and lifeless. Many farmers stopped even glancing at the weather reports. There was no point. That year, nearly 1 in 5 acres of Kansas wheat was abandoned before harvest, the highest rate in over 100 years. Only 2 years earlier, losses had been about 4%. On one large operation near the western border, almost half of its 9,000 acres never saw the combine. In certain counties, as much as 60% of the crop was left to wither. The statewide yield fell to around 191 million bushels, the lowest since 1963. For people who live by the land, those aren't numbers, they're heartbreaks. The bills don't stop just because the rain does. Tractors still need fuel, insurance still needs signatures, and the banks still call. Farmers speak about it in short, guarded sentences, as if sparing each other the pain. One man from Sharon Springs said watching his fields die was like watching a loved one fade away while you stood helpless. By midsummer, families began liquidating whatever they could. Some pulled cattle off pasture early to stretch feed supplies. Others parked machines they could no longer afford to repair. Grain elevators fell silent. Fewer trucks rolled, and roads once busy with harvest convoys grew eerily still. Cafe booths sat half empty. Repair shops went quiet before noon. A small-town salon owner west of Dodge City whispered, "Everything I own depends on this place. If it fails, I do too." The shock spread faster than the drought itself. Co-ops cut back workers. Seed companies offered extensions few could take, and small banks started recalling loans ahead of schedule. It wasn't just the loss of crops. It was the slow unraveling of a way of life. Beneath it all, the groundwater continued to fall. The Ogallala Aquifer, the underground reservoir that once shielded Kansas from its worst years, is slipping away. In many western counties, wells dropped more than a foot in a single year. Pumps strain harder each season to draw less water, draining what little profit remains. Now the fields look frozen in time, as though waiting for a harvest that will never arrive. Along Highway 50, irrigation lines stretch over brown earth like relics. Barns stand open-mouthed, machines inside coated with dust. For every acre still producing, another lies still. Silent reminders of what once fed a nation. In Kansas, no one calls it failure. They just say it's another dry year, then another after that. But everyone knows what those words mean. The land has stopped responding. Work that once supported generations now barely sustains a month. And when the sun sinks behind the plains, the horizon still glows with the memory of what it used to be. Faded like an old photograph left too long in the light. If you're finding this helpful so far, take a quick second to subscribe for more practical survival strategies. Hit the like button to let me know this content is useful, and share your own thoughts or experiences in the comments. I always enjoy hearing different perspectives. Oklahoma. From afar, Oklahoma still looks serene. The sky stretches clear. The land rolls gently, and the first hints of wheat add a blush of green. But the illusion fades fast. By late spring, large stretches of the state had turned the shade of dust. Grain heads stayed empty, stalks scorched before summer even began. In some counties, farmers parked their combines mid-row and never returned. That year, nearly half of Oklahoma's wheat was lost. Of the 4 million acres planted, only about 2 million were harvested. The state managed to produce only about 54 million bushels, less than half of what would mark a typical harvest year. In many northern regions, reports showed that 6 out of 10 fields had been abandoned entirely. The cause wasn't mysterious. Oklahoma's success hinges on precise timing. Wheat depends on autumn rainfall to take root before the winter sets in. But in 2023, fall came dry as bone. Seeds sprouted weakly, shallow in the soil, and then faced relentless dry winds for months. When the rains finally returned, it was already too late. The plants had already determined their growth patterns and couldn't bounce back. Even an ideal May couldn't fix what November had already undone. Irrigation offered little refuge. Groundwater levels across the western counties continued to fall, and pumps failed to keep pace. In some regions, wells dropped more than a foot within a single year. Each gallon of water demanded more fuel to reach the surface, and the meager yield it saved barely justified the cost. The losses hit hard. Average yields hovered near 25 bushels per acre, far below the usual 30 to 40. Fields that once supported both grain and grazing stood barren. Overall production fell by more than 20% from the prior season, and more than half compared with the year before that. What had once been Oklahoma's anchor of stability had become a gaping deficit in the state's economy. Still, the farmers didn't give up. Some cut their stunted wheat early, baling it into hay to salvage at least some return before the heads turned white. Others experimented with quicker maturing varieties or planted cover crops to hold the soil until better days. Ranchers turned cattle loose on failed wheat fields just to offset feed costs. The state's Agricultural Extension Service joined the effort, testing crop rotations and alternative planting schedules in hopes of rebuilding resilience one field at a time. By mid-2024, faint signs of recovery appeared. A few central counties recorded yields nearing 30 bushels per acre, and green shoots returned to landscapes that had been lifeless the year before. Yet optimism stayed guarded. Heat waves arrived earlier than normal. Dry winds swept across the plains again, and water tables continued their decline. Costs for seed, fertilizer, and fuel climbed higher still. One decent season couldn't disguise the fragility beneath it all. Researchers now describe Oklahoma's climate as the most unstable it's been in recorded memory. Shorter bursts of rain, longer spells of dryness, and more extreme temperature shifts. Such volatility punishes winter wheat, which depends on steady conditions rather than abundance. Farmers can adjust their methods, but they can't restore lost groundwater or conjure moisture from hope alone. Oklahoma has endured droughts before, but this one runs deeper. It's not just the weather, it's the shrinking margin for survival, tightening each passing year. From the sky, the fields still gleam when the sunlight hits just right. But on the ground, every acre tells the same weary story. Land fighting to endure, and people waiting once more for the sky to keep its promise. Texas. Every field out here used to hold cotton, said Stephen Walker, a third-generation farmer in the Texas Panhandle. A year like this, where everything turns to disaster, it breaks you. He looked out over acres of bare red dirt, the same soil his father and grandfather had sown for decades. The stalks were gone, the lint never formed, and all that remained was dust rising and settling like a reminder of what used to be. In 2022, Texas faced one of the worst agricultural crises in its history. Cotton, the crop that defines the state's identity, collapsed under a drought of record-breaking intensity. Nearly 7 out of every 10 acres, about 5 million in total, were abandoned before harvest. Overall cotton production plunged to less than a third of the previous year's yield, and the economic damage exceeded $2 billion in direct losses. Even irrigated land struggled. Falling groundwater levels and relentless heat overwhelmed systems that once cushioned farmers from dry spells. Across much of the high plains, irrigation efficiency plummeted as water evaporated faster than pumps could supply it. The failure was painfully simple. Cotton needs steady moisture in its early growth phase to develop deep roots. Without rain, seedlings stalled, roots stayed shallow, and when temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks, the topsoil baked hard. Whatever moisture remained vanished into the air. Plants shut down to survive, dropping leaves before the cotton bolls could even form. In irrigated tracts, farmers pushed pumps to the limit, but the Ogallala aquifer's declining levels restricted what could be drawn. Each extra hour of pumping demanded more fuel and returned less benefit. Even with modern drip irrigation, salinity buildup and extreme heat combined to slash yields by half. For the cotton industry, the collapse was not isolated. It was systemic. Gins across the South Plains operated at barely half their usual capacity. Warehouses stood half empty. Trucking firms that once hauled millions of bales through Lubbock, Amarillo, and Plainview began canceling routes altogether. Export terminals near Houston saw steep shipment declines, rippling down the global textile chain as far as Southeast Asia. The collapse of Texas cotton, responsible for roughly 40% of the nation's output, briefly drove raw fiber prices higher around the world before foreign imports filled the gap. State and federal agencies attempted to respond. The Texas Department of Agriculture expanded drought disaster declarations, giving farmers access to emergency loans and extended crop insurance coverage. The USDA rolled out cost-sharing initiatives to support irrigation upgrades and water conservation research. Universities joined in, developing new drought-tolerant cotton strains bred for shorter growing periods and stronger resistance to extreme heat. Yet, despite all these measures, the relief was shallow. Many producers found the paperwork cumbersome, the qualifications strict, and the aid too small to cover even replanting expenses. In interviews, farmers often praised the effort but questioned the effect, comparing the assistance to patching a leaking roof in a storm. On the ground, adaptation blurred into sheer survival. Some farmers converted acreage to sorghum, a crop more suited to hot, dry soil. Others turned to cover crops to rebuild organic matter and retain what little moisture remained. Conservation tillage, long discussed but seldom practiced, suddenly became essential to prevent the loss of topsoil. By late 2024, parts of north-central Texas showed faint signs of revival. But the foundation had shifted. Groundwater kept declining, summers stayed hotter, and financial cushions grew thinner. Stephen Walker's family keeps going because they have no other option. His wife manages the books. His oldest son works part-time off the farm just to help pay the bills. They maintain their tractors not out of faith in the next harvest, but because neglecting them would mean surrender. At night, Walker still walks the fence line, scanning the horizon for signs of rain. Hope isn't gone, he says quietly. It's just quieter now. And in Texas, quiet doesn't mean despair. It means waiting, uncertain when relief will finally come. California. What happens when some of the planet's most fertile ground runs out of the water it depends on? In California, that question isn't hypothetical. It's already carved into the landscape. Over the past 3 years, the state has witnessed an extraordinary retreat from one of its most profitable crops, almonds. In 2022, over 60,000 acres of orchards were pulled out. The next year, another 83,000 were gone. By 2024, an additional 67,000 acres had been cut, burned, or left to wither. In just 3 seasons, more than 200,000 acres vanished. the first sustained decline after decades of relentless growth. The cause is harshly simple. The water is either gone or too expensive to access. California's vast agricultural system depends far more on irrigation than rainfall. But groundwater reserves have been shrinking for years, and new state regulations have capped how much can be pumped. Under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, every basin must reduce overuse and reach balance by 2040. For many growers, that timeline feels less like protection and more like a ticking clock. The economic fallout has been immense. Losses from the droughts of 2021 and 2022 each topped $1 billion. Land dependent solely on wells has lost up to half its value. Parcels that once sold for $20,000 an acre now fetch $10,000 or less, simply because their wells can't sustain deep irrigation anymore. Banks that once eagerly financed new orchards are pulling back, reassessing water scarcity as a core financial risk. In parts of the San Joaquin Valley, real estate agents now talk about water the way they used to talk about oil, a resource both priceless and unreliable. David Zilberman, an agricultural economist at UC Berkeley, explains that California isn't technically running out of water, it's running out of affordable water. His research shows that as pumping costs rise, farmers shift into survival mode, replacing thirsty crops like almonds with olives or grapes, or abandoning cultivation entirely. Once the cost of water overtakes the profit per acre, the logical decision is not to plant at all. For smaller family operations, that threshold has already been crossed. The ripple effects are unmistakable. Almond processors have begun shutting facilities early in the season. Trucking firms are merging routes or closing down. Small towns that once revolved around the harvest now endure a slow, quiet recession. Equipment dealers, fertilizer suppliers, and irrigation companies all report sales declines of 30 to 40%. A reflection not of laziness, but of a state where the fields themselves are being forced to pause. In rural towns, every missed harvest ripples through the community. Fewer jobs, shrinking school enrollments, and one less reason for young people to stay. Behind those statistics are the families who live the losses. People like Maria Alvarez, who tends a modest 200-acre almond orchard near Fresno. This year, she's uprooted nearly half her trees. The rest still bloom, but the wells run weaker, and the water deliveries grow shorter with each season. In the evenings, she and her father walk the rows, testing soil by hand, trying to stretch their dwindling supply through the next wave of heat. Her teenage son talks about leaving for college, and maybe not coming back. When asked what she plans to do next, Maria just gives a small shrug. "We'll wait," she says, "and see if the rain remembers us." That waiting has become California's quiet refrain. The stillness between the numbers, the pause between the seasons. And farther north, where water doesn't vanish but overwhelms, another kind of loss takes shape. There, the crops don't die of thirst, they drown. Iowa. Where California cracked under dryness, Iowa broke beneath the weight of too much rain. Two extremes of the same story. One starved, the other flooded. Both reminders that nature keeps its own memory, even when we forget. By late June 2024, the rain simply refused to stop. It didn't fall in showers, but in relentless sheets. 10 inches in some places, even more in others. Rivers burst past their banks, swallowing fields, fences, and the faint outlines of farmhouses. From Sioux City to Rock Valley, corn and soybean fields turned into shallow lakes, mirroring a sky that no longer seemed kind. Tractors sat half buried in mud. Hay bales floated down county roads. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and diesel into every open window. When the waters finally began to recede, hundreds of thousands of acres lay submerged. Nearly 5,000 farms reported direct losses or severe delays in planting. Damages to crops, livestock, machinery, and infrastructure climbed beyond $1 billion. For a state built on predictability, the numbers told a story of fragility. Iowa's most reliable season had become its most uncertain. But numbers can't capture the sound of loss. Tom Jensen, a farmer from Sioux County, stood in what used to be his cornfield and said quietly, "We prayed for rain 3 years straight. Now it's all I see." His voice held no anger, just exhaustion, the kind that comes when you do everything right and still lose. Around him, flooded grain bins gaped open like broken memories. Across Iowa, families returned to homes layered with silt, schoolyards turned into debris fields, and volunteer trucks slogged slower than the water they came to fight. It wasn't Iowa's first flood, but this one felt different. Broader, heavier, more intimate. People mentioned 1-in-100-year storms with the hollow tone of disbelief, as though the phrase had lost all meaning. Each decade seemed to bring another. Scientists have a term for it: hydrologic whiplash, the violent swing between drought and flood sharpening with every degree of global warming. Warmer air holds more moisture, so rain falls harder, faster, and longer. The land, already saturated from a wet spring, had no time to drain or breathe. Drainage systems built 50 years ago were never meant for storms like these. Decades of fertilizer runoff, sediment buildup, and vanishing wetlands stripped away the state's natural buffers. The water had nowhere to go, so it went everywhere. That's the quiet tragedy beneath it all. This wasn't just bad luck. It was the echo of decades of overuse and oversight. For generations, the rivers have carried the runoff of modern agriculture: nitrogen, phosphorus, chemicals designed to grow food. But along with them came the slow erosion of balance. Floodplains were narrowed, soil compacted, streams straightened to save time, losing their ability to slow water. The land grew efficient, but fragile. No one in Iowa needs to be told that. They see it in cloudy well water, in fish dying where they once swam as children, in rain that used to feel like a blessing, now carrying a hint of fear. When they rebuild, and they always do, it's with steadier hands, heavier eyes, and the quiet knowledge that the next disaster isn't far away, just different. Tom Jensen's family moved their furniture upstairs, hoping the water would stop before it reached the second floor. His daughter asked if they'd plant again next year. He paused, watching the brown current carve through his field, and finally said, almost to himself, "It's not the water I'm afraid of. It's that we made it this way." Iowa suffers now. But maybe it's only one point on a circle we all drew. The cycle where the harvest of our choices has finally come due. South Dakota. The storms that drowned Iowa drifted northward, but by the time they reached South Dakota, they lost their strength. There were no flooding headlines, no frantic alerts, just silence, the kind that unsettles rather than soothes. The air hung still. The soil looked ready, but the fields stayed bare far longer than anyone expected. This was supposed to be a normal year. Instead, it began late, ended early, and seemed to skip the middle entirely. Spring arrived with unpredictable freezes, followed by bursts of rain too intense to use. The seed beds crusted over, the topsoil dried out, and by the time farmers brought their planters out, half their planting window had already vanished. Across the state, the rhythm of seeding, a ritual that once defined time itself, fell apart. By mid-June, planting reports showed progress lagging nearly 3 weeks behind average. Corn sprouted unevenly. Soybeans emerged thin and weak. Then summer heat sealed the pattern. Shallow roots, fragile stalks, and yields that fell short. By harvest, production was down over 10% statewide, and insurance claims had tripled from the year before. The loss didn't look like disaster. It looked like weariness. No flooded fields, no parched cracks, just acres that never reached full color. Machinery rested longer in the sheds. Highways on the eastern plains carried fewer grain trucks. Elevators took in less, and feed mills shortened their shifts. It wasn't one catastrophe. It was the slow accumulation of many small ones. For generations, South Dakota was considered the balance point of the plains. Kansas dried out, Iowa drowned, but here the weather usually held steady. Enough rain, enough sun, or just enough to keep life in rhythm. Now even that balance has slipped. The line that once separated wet from dry has blurred, and the familiar patterns farmers depended on no longer arrive when they should. Beneath the surface lies the deeper issue. The land has been living on borrowed strength. Years of heavy tillage and chemical use have thinned the topsoil, stripped away its organic cushion, and left it less able to hold water when rain comes. Now storms run off before soaking in, and when they stop, the ground dries faster than ever. What once made the soil resilient has turned brittle. Climate change didn't create this fragility, it revealed it. Fertilizers that once guaranteed yields now feed algae blooms in nearby lakes. Herbicides that saved time now linger in groundwater. Fields that once nourished the world now demand more from the earth than it can give back. People feel it not as shock, but as slow recognition. Farmers no longer speak with certainty about next year. Their language has changed. Every hope framed by if. If the rain holds, if the heat breaks, if the soil still has life left to give. In small towns, the unease shows in the pauses. Stores closing earlier, churches quieter on Sundays, main streets a little emptier each harvest. The land hasn't failed. It's simply grown tired. And tired soil makes tired people. There's no bitterness here, only quiet acceptance. The understanding that progress and decline can sometimes look the same. South Dakota didn't collapse in a single storm. It simply drifted out of rhythm. From above, the fields still gleam green, but up close the rows falter, uneven, hesitant, as though unsure they want to grow at all. This is the season that never quite began. And when it ends, there's no clear line between what was lost and what was simply spent. Farther west, the horizon begins to rise again. The soil grows thinner, the winds sharper, and beyond the last flat mile of the plains, the story of endurance faces its final trial. A place where survival depends not on drought or rain, but on what kind of future the land will still allow. Montana. Here at last is Montana, where the plains give way to mountains and silence stretches farther than the eye can see. From above, the land appears untouched. Bands of wheat sweep toward the horizon. Rivers shimmer beneath the sun, and the air drifts slow and clear. Nothing looks broken. But look closer, and you'll find a stillness that doesn't belong. The wind still carries dust, but it's finer now, lighter, almost empty. The soil still breathes, but more shallowly. This isn't ruin. It's erosion that learned how to whisper. Montana never saw the sudden collapses that scarred Kansas or Texas. No infernos, no floods. Its transformation crept in quietly. A winter a little shorter, a spring a little drier, a summer that lingered too long. Snow once fed the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers deep into late summer. Now it melts weeks earlier. By August, the riverbeds shrink to half their former size, and irrigation canals thin to a trickle. Out east, ranchers graze fewer cattle, not because the grass has disappeared, but because it no longer grows back fast enough to feed them. Over the past 20 years, Montana's average snowpack has declined by nearly 20%. What once acted as a slow, reliable reservoir now melts too quickly, releasing its water long before it's truly needed. The result is rivers that surge when demand is low and shrink when every drop counts. A yearly confession written in ice and time. On the surface, Montana's economy still looks stable. Agriculture remains a cornerstone, employing thousands, but the fine margins that once kept it whole are thinning. Since 2020, hay prices have risen by half. Diesel costs have doubled compared to pre-pandemic levels. Insurance premiums climb with each new climate report. None of these changes appear catastrophic alone, yet together they erase what little profit remains. Increasingly, Ranchers sell small pieces of land or lease their water rights just to stay afloat. Survival here no longer means expansion. It means holding steady without slipping backward. What makes this balance harder is the growing unpredictability. Some years bring October blizzards. Others see no snow until January. June may strike with sudden heat, while frost still touches crops in May. Wildfires now burn into September. The calendar, once a dependable map of the seasons, has become unreliable. Even the mountains, the old symbols of constancy, seem to shift their own schedules, as if testing how long everything below can endure. Scientists call this pattern hydrologic volatility, a climate too erratic to forecast, too unstable to trust. But beyond the jargon lies a simpler truth. Instability has become the norm. The rivers still move, the wheat still grows, yet the cadence feels altered. You can hear it in the way people talk, carefully, deliberately, aware that fortune and failure now walk the same line. Still, Montana resists drama. It endures quietly. It doesn't plead or protest. It waits. This land has survived fire, drought, and greed long before we had names for them. It carries memories of buffalo paths, abandoned homesteads, and a promise repeated for generations that we could keep taking without ever giving back. Montana is what remains when that promise is finally spent. Perhaps that's why its silence feels different. Kansas cried out. Texas broke. Iowa drowned. California bargained. But Montana simply stands, observing, absorbing. Its lesson isn't about rain or rivers. It's about time, how much we borrowed and how little we repaid. The people who remain still plant, still mend fences, still raise their herds beneath a restless sky. But they do it without illusions. They've learned that endurance isn't victory. It's recognition. It's the quiet acceptance that life now unfolds within the limits of a world we've pushed too far. So the journey concludes here, not with destruction, but with understanding. The harvest ended long before the crops did, and the earth will outlast us all, carrying both our achievements and our failures until it decides what to grow next. We've seen the land at its lowest, scorched, flooded, muted. We've walked among barns left unopened, along rivers that no longer wait, through fields that have lost faith in the seasons that once sustained them. The truth is plain and heavy. This is the cost of abundance. The harvest didn't collapse in a single year. It unraveled over decades of prosperity when taking felt easier than giving back. Yet even in the quiet aftermath, something persists. A few seeds still pierce the crust. A few hands still plant, not from hope, but from responsibility. The understanding that renewal begins with care. The land bears its wounds but has not surrendered. And if a new dawn is coming, it won't descend from the sky. It will rise from us when we finally remember how to listen to the soil again.